Berserk is a story that has a lot to offer besides the gore and violence that most casual observers think it's fixated on. Yes, there is a lot of blood and brutality in Berserk, but nearly all of it has important narrative context and consequence, so calling it a glorified slasher is not nearly as accurate as Berserk haters think it is. This is a story with nuance, incredible characters, actual tangible character progression, and best of all, some top-tier mysteries that remain unanswered even 30 plus years after the series' first chapter was serialized. When you think of Berserk mysteries, the usual suspects tend to pop up in your minds. Who were the God Hand in their previous lives? Who was Skull Knight? Can Griffith be killed via the Moonlight Boy? Etc, etc. But the one we want to focus on today took place 1,000 years ago and is arguably the inception point of most of the Berserk world's misery in the modern day. That's right, folks. We're talking about the downfall of Supreme King Gaiseric and his continental empire. Gaiseric is only spoken of at length in a single chapter across the near 400 chapter run of Berserk, and yet the decline of his empire lies at the heart of the very story that Kentaro Miura was trying to tell. This is because, in Miura's words, Berserk is a 1,000-year-old story. So figuring out what happened back then might tell us what's going to happen next. So without further ado, this is how we think Supreme King Gaiseric's empire fell. An obscure history lesson on the secret origins of Midland. The first and only time we hear the story of King Gaiseric's downfall. To a lot of different readers, Berserk means different things. To some of us, it's a love story. To others, it's a story about the indomitable human will. To yet others, it's a harrowing tale about all the evil that human society harbors within itself. But to hear Kentaro Miura tell it, Berserk is not a story that's only focused on its current timeline's vices. It's actually a story that spans 1,000 years. Miura wanted his audience to know that the past of Berserk is intricately linked to its future, and everything is going to tie into everything else once all was said and done. Perhaps this is why the chapter where we're introduced to the fabled kingdom of King Gaiseric is titled Thousand-Year Fiefdom, because it talks about the 1,000-year history of the kingdom of Midland, how it all began with one man. The definition of a fiefdom is a territory or a sphere of influence that is controlled by a single group of people or a single leader themselves. These days, the fiefdom of Midland is controlled by the Midland royal family, which includes Princess Charlotte and her father, the king. Charlotte's birth mother died a long time ago, and the rest of her family, like her stepmother, her uncle, and her cousin, were killed by Griffith on his path to becoming a royal from a commoner, though she doesn't know that yet. At this point in the story, Charlotte was the last living scion of the Midland royal family, so it was quite courageous and scandalous of her to assist the Griffith rescue party in, well, rescuing Griffith. Charlotte had been portrayed as a meek, timid, and traditional kind of gal. Her first appearance saw her not even move a muscle until her father commanded her to do so. But that Griffith pipe must be something different because he sprayed his pheromones in her direction, and ever since, Charlotte just hasn't been the same. During the year that the Band of the Falcon was on the run, she was their secret contact within Wyndham. And when Casca and the rest of the rescue crew arrived in Wyndham, she led them into the city through a secret entrance, boldly bribed guards off their tail, and insisted that she be allowed to rescue Griffith with them because her dedication to him had grown to such levels. After much debate and discussion, Casca, as the leader of the group, allows her inclusion in the rescue mission as they head down the Tower of Rebirth, given that Charlotte was the one who had gotten them this far in the first place. As the group descended the towering structure, Guts was impressed by what he saw, so he decided to make his thoughts known by saying out loud that the inside of the tower was a lot deeper than the part that was over ground. As they're walking downstairs, Charlotte gets spooked by the jailer of the Tower of Rebirth and ends up needing Guts' assistance to continue the journey downward. Guts isn't too thrilled about it because he dislikes soft upper-class behavior like this, but he decides to help out Charlotte because it means getting closer to Griffith faster. Once she accepts his help, they continue their journey downward, and Guts once again comments on the depth of the inner sanctum of the Tower of Rebirth. He wonders out loud just how deep this whole thing goes, which sends Charlotte into an impromptu history lesson about the tower and the kingdom of Midland itself. She tells the crew that the underground prison within the tower was no deeper than the length of the tower over ground, but the gaping pit that extended beyond it had existed there long before the prison was built. Charlotte claims that its depth was larger than any mountain in existence, and this prompts Guts to ask the next most obvious question in this history lesson. What's at the bottom of the pit? Charlotte decides to answer this question by asking one of her own. Did the gang know the true reason behind the Kingdom of Midland's name? Guts speaks for us when he says that they don't, and asks Charlotte what that has to do with all of this, which is when the real history lesson ends. 1,000 years ago, the continent of man was divided divided into numerous tribes and city-states that constantly fought with each other over territory. It was called an Age of Warlords, and as the name might suggest, it was a terrible time for all people. Charlotte claims that because of famines, disease, and near constant battles, a full third of the global population perished during the Age of Warlords. Guts comments that things haven't changed much since then, but Charlotte corrects him by saying that things changed back then, with the appearance of a single man on the global stage, Supreme King Gaiseric. No one knows where he originated from. No records of his life exist before he erupted on the global theater of war with his own army. No one even knows how he got that army in the first place, but Gaiseric managed to accomplish a feat that has never been repeated since his lifetime. He used his immense strength and military strategies to conquer and subjugate the entire continent of man, uniting multiple warring countries and fiefs under a single banner, his banner, and ruling over them as the only emperor of mankind in human history. Guts thinks this sounds a lot like Griffith, and he's not wrong in thinking that because Griffith was practically unknown before he became a war legend with his Band of the Falcon, and no one really knows how he put together the band in the first place, not even us. Yet he managed to become the White Phoenix General and gain peerage amongst nobility despite being a commoner. He was on track to become King of Midland before he slipped up and ended up in need of rescuing in the first place. But what Charlotte says next completely throws Guts off his mental train of thought. She continues on with her history lesson and claims that Gaiseric's ruthless and merciless approach to battle earned him many dreadful nicknames from his enemies, like the Demon King or the King of Galloping Death, but the tactics wouldn't have been as effective if it didn't have the optics to match it, and King Gaiseric was notorious for riding into battle wearing a terrifying skull helmet. This immediately makes Guts think of that mysterious Skull Knight he met all the way back in chapter 37, over a year before the events of chapter 53, but he immediately dismisses the association in his own mind by thinking it couldn't be that guy. Judo, who had apparently been listening to all of this with a bit of skepticism, chimes in after hearing the description of Gaiseric's helmet and says that there's a fairy tale that is related to the story, the fairy tale of the Skull King. In this story, it's said that the legendary Skull King gathered workers from all over his empire and put them hard to work at building a massive capital city. Many workers died in the process, but the city was made, and once construction finished, the Skull King turned it into a place of luxury and utmost debauchery. The Skull Knight lived in opulence and gluttony while he levied higher and higher taxes on his dying subjects, and this continued until one day God decided he couldn't stomach such sinful acts anymore and sent down 5 angels to destroy Gaiseric's capital of sin. Through lightning and great earthquakes, these angels destroyed Gaiseric's city overnight, and the city itself sort of just disappeared without a trace. Casca chimes in and asks Judo whether there were 4 angels or 5, to which his attitude is basically either or, but Charlotte then says that even if the legend was untrue, the city itself at least existed. The reason behind the Kingdom of Midland being named so was because it derived its title from Gaiseric's mythic capital city. Apparently, because his capital was situated in the land in the middle of nations, it received the name Midland. And you're not hearing this wrong, folks. What is currently a kingdom used to be a city 1,000 years ago. And that city is what lies at the bottom of the pit, according to Princess Charlotte. She says that the city, which was said to have fallen due to natural calamities, is what now resides in the hole of the Tower of Rebirth, untouched by sunlight or wind, sleeping, waiting. Guts doubts the veracity of these stories, and Charlotte admits that she heard all of this from her history teacher and her father, so she can't confirm how much of it is true, but she does have 2 facts in her mind that seem to back up these claims. The first is with regards to her own lineage. Though it is said that the Supreme King died without an heir, the Midland royal family claims to this day that they contain Gaiseric's blood in their veins, which is what they use to legitimize their claim to the throne, in our opinion. This can be seen reflected in their flag as well, as Midland's royal standard is a quartered representation of the sun, moon, lightning, and stars, with a crest bearing a crown tower in the middle of it. The implications of these symbols is that the Kingdom of Midland basically claims dominion over everything under the sky, which was true in Gaiseric's day, so the current version of their standard could actually just be an unchanged relic from their secretive past, and it would also explain why chapter 53 is called 1,000-year fiefdom. The second and more important fact that Charlotte states is that the royal family had sent investigative teams into the hole at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth multiple times, but not one of them had ever returned. In fact, the very reason that the tower was constructed was to obstruct Midland's unclean past from reaching its present citizenry, which makes sense because the way Miura draws all of this, it looks like the Tower of Rebirth is sitting atop a small opening that leads to the aforementioned mountain-sized crater housing Gaiseric's dead city. Now, all of this sounded like too much of a stretch to the rest of the party because Judo jokes about there being ghosts within the Tower of Rebirth, and it freaks out Charlotte. who then chokes out Guts. But in the middle of all of this, Casca drops her torch, which ends up falling into that hole, and we end up following it for the next couple of pages. Initially, the trajectory of the torch showed nothing but empty blackness in the background, but soon it started illuminating classical architecture that could only have been created during King Gaiseric's era. We see it pass a statue with an elaborate headdress and another, and land at what appears to be the wreckage of a Pantheon-esque structure with multiple dead bodies strewn all over the place. Miura takes some time to show off the dozens, possibly hundreds of corpses that lie at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth because it serves two purposes. Number one, it proves that Charlotte's story, as bizarre as it sounded, was true. The architecture and the corpses prove that a city did indeed lie at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. And number two, it furthers the mystery of the collapse it attempts to demystify, because just as we think that the bodies are the main point of this scene, it turns out we're entirely wrong. The panels zoom in on the skulls of the corpses, and we see each of them was marked with a brand of sacrifice. Now, this is odd because we know that if a person's body contains that brand, it will attract evil spirits until they end up sending their souls to the abyss. Now, it's possible that these bodies had their souls sent to the abyss because just looking at their condition, they're entirely emaciated. But that could also just explain why the brand appears on their foreheads in the first place. This is the biggest part of the mystery of the fall of King Gaiseric's empire if you ask us, and it's frustrating that the manga never really overtly revisits this tale ever again. Gaiseric is mentioned a few more times, sure, but never as extensively as in chapter 53, and there's never an explanation for the branded bodies in the bottom of the pit either way, except that there is one. It's just buried underneath a lot of layered plot structuring and intentional ambiguity on Miura's part. A tortured sage and an ancient metropolis reborn. The clues Miura left us regarding the downfall of King Gaiseric's empire. Following chapter 53, King Gaiseric's name is directly invoked on only 3 occasions over the course of the entire series. The first time is in chapter 138, when Father Mosgus relates to Lady Farnace, Serpico, and us, the audience, a story about a certain sage from Gaiseric's era. Chapter 138 takes place in the middle of the Conviction arc, which is set majorly in and around the Tower of Conviction, a hulking behemoth of a structure that is reminiscent of its twin in the city of Windham, yet at the same time entirely different from it as well. Mosgus says that during Gaiseric's era, there was a certain sage who proclaimed the Skull King's excesses and sins to God daily, and was imprisoned within the tower for that crime. Gaiseric allegedly tortured the man something proper, but he kept on with his proclamations through the pain until one day an angel was made to descend. Mosgus then says that surely the Tower of Conviction had holy significance because of this act, implying that the angel gave the sage salvation and then punished Gaiseric for his crimes. But he never actually says this, and besides, his claim of only a single angel coming for the sage sort of neatly lines up with the angel discrepancy that Casca and Judo were talking about in chapter 53, because they were confused about whether Gaiseric's empire was sunk by 4 angels or 5. But keeping all that aside, this is the first of the 3 overt references to Gaiseric following chapter 53. The second one takes place in the immediate aftermath of the Great Roar of the Astral World. This one is more of a reference to the fallen city of the Supreme King, but as soon as the human contingent of the reborn Band of the Falcon sees a city rise up from where the body of Shiva the Destroyer used to be, all of them end up coming to the same conclusion. The Pope speaks it into words by asking out loud whether the majestic capital they saw in front of them was in fact the capital city of King Gaiseric risen again. But then he thought better of asking himself a question like that, because if it was the city, then it only further proved the divinity of Griffith as the Falcon of Light in the Pope's eyes. Perhaps it was this that caused everyone gathered to blindly follow Griffith's command to enter the capital city, despite them having just seen the true form of the war demons. But it is this city where the final overt invocation of King Gaiseric's name takes place. In chapter 358, after securing Falconia, his new capital, from a contingent of giants and a hydra lairing in the east, Griffith returns to the city and immediately proposes his vision for its prosperity. The ministers of the Council of Falconia were too concerned with coping with the changes that had happened to the world. Griffith, not so much. He makes a grandiose speech about how, in order to survive in this new world, Falconians shouldn't aim to simply get by, they should aim to prosper. Griffith lays out several plans for putting up new public service buildings, revolutionizing the army, creating more jobs, and giving more education to Falconians. And he does all this because he has a vision. Towards the conclusion of the meeting, Griffith tells the counselors of Falconia that in ancient times, Supreme King Gaiseric managed to create an empire that spanned the entire length of the continent of man, so they too should aspire to show what they can create. create. Griffith proposes that they create a second empire with Falconia as its center, and everyone scampers off trying to scrounge together the resources to make Griffith's dream become reality. Apart from a small confirmation from Guru Gedfring in chapter 345 that Falconia was in fact Gaiseric City reborn, these three are the only major references to King Gaiseric and the downfall of his empire throughout the series. Except we told you guys that that's not the entire story, and a lot of the secrets of this mysterious empire and its downfall were hidden in the subtle messaging of the plot. And this is where we ask you to put on the tinfoil and become one with the hive mind that is our Berserk playlist. Supporters and longtime viewers of the channel will know what our opinion is on some of this stuff already, but if you haven't seen any of our stuff, then we suggest you go to our Berserk playlist and check out every video related to the Skull Knight and Void, because TLDR, Void is the current existence of that tortured sage from chapter 138, and Skull Knight is the current existence of King Gaiseric himself. We'll explain the former in the next segment because that's where it truly becomes relevant, but the latter we'll break down right now. For a long time, Berserk fans have suspected that Skull Knight is basically what's left of King Gaiseric put into a skeletal armor, and that's been hinted at many times in the series, including the first time Gaiseric is brought up and we learn of the fairy tale of the Skull King. There are three major occasions where Skull Knight is called Your Majesty, or the King. The first is by Slan, when they encounter one another in Kliphof. The second is by Guru Gedfring on Elfhelm, and the third is also on Elfhelm, but it comes from the dwarf blacksmith Hanar, who is an integral part to understanding the mystery behind the downfall of King Gaiseric's empire. You'll see why in just a few moments. Apart from this, there are also other hints, such as Flora being friends with both Skull Knight and Gedfring, two entities that seemingly have no relation to one another until you factor in their pasts, and this statement by Zod during his first on-page face-to-face with his eternal rival. In chapter 80, as Skull Knight attempts to force his way into the interstice that was currently hosting Griffith's eclipse, he's stopped in his tracks by Zod, who anticipated his arrival. The Immortal One snorts at the predictable nature of Skull Knight's interventions, and then says something very interesting. He says that Skull Knight has been their foe for a millennium, which is interesting because Zod himself has only existed for 300 years, and it is said that King Gaiseric's empire fell 1,000 years ago in chapter 53. We also learned during Griffith's eclipse that this particular type of ceremony only occurs once every 216 years, and him turning into Femto completes the God Hand, so the first one must have ascended around 1,000 years ago, which is roughly the same time frame that Skull Knight has spent fighting the God Hand as well. In chapter 237, we learn that Skull Knight was actually the former user of the Berserker armor, which can only mean that when he calls himself a wandering wraith these days, he means it literally, because as we all know, the Berserker armor is liable to kill you while you're using it if you aren't cognizant of your thoughts and emotions, and the fact that when Guts first wears the Berserker armor, its helmet is actually shaped like a skull, and that honestly should have been a dead giveaway, but hey, that's the power of hindsight. None of these implications actually confirm that Skull Knight is Gaiseric. Until this day, we have never officially been told this by the story, but all fingers point towards that direction, especially once the crew reaches Elfhelm, because, crucially, time flows differently in Elfhelm, which means that many of its inhabitants could potentially be thousands of years old without us even realizing it. We think that's exactly the case for Gedfring and Hanar, because it's pretty clear from the way they interact with Skull Knight that they knew him in his previous life as well, as King Gaiseric. In chapter 361, Gedfring pretty much confirms this when he recalls the audiences he used to attend with his father as a child in the presence of His Majesty, before correcting himself and asking if Skull Knight was what he went by now. Skull Knight recalls Gedfring's father's name, and this pretty much throws the former's former identity as King Gaiseric in our faces. If that wasn't good enough, when Skull Knight and Gedfring take Guts to meet Hanar, the dwarven blacksmith immediately scoffs at Skull Knight's direction and addresses him as the King. Skull Knight tries to cajole his old friend into a conversation by claiming he's in good health thanks to the armor Hanar made him, but the blacksmith is a bitter cynic. He simply calls the armor a coffin that the Skull Knight prattles out of and nothing more. And this is when we start to realize just what might have happened when the Wandering Wraith's empire fell. Then we go into chapter 362, and we actually get to see the moment that this entire video is centered around, the final moments of Skull Knight's human life. Because if Skull Knight wasn't Gaiseric, then the people that showed up in that vision were seriously looking to corrupt the world. Because if they weren't, chapter 362 pretty much explains every secret we've laid out with respect to the downfall of Gaiseric's empire, including the bodies with the brand of sacrifice marked on their foreheads. So let's get into it. And yes, we will be giving you textual evidence backing our theories all the while as well. A foolish king driven by conquest and bloodlust who lost his empire to a demonic ritual and ended up a wandering wraith himself. The truth behind the downfall of King Gaiseric's empire. Chapter 362 doesn't contain much dialogue. It instead focuses on giving us visual cues as to what happened at the moment of King Gaiseric's death, because that's exactly what it's all about. In Chapter 361, Hanar decides that he'll let Guts have a peek at the blood memories of the last user of the Berserker armor to give him an idea of just how dangerous the thing actually was. He strikes the armor with his hammer, which immediately goes into full activation and starts showing Guts a vision from the final moments of Skull Knight's human life. At first, all we see is a desolate landscape that kind of looks like a city block covered in spine tentacles. Then we start seeing furry, apostle-like creatures emerging from the crevices between the tentacles, but they're immediately slashed into bits from the first-person perspective, so we at least know that it was Skull Knight putting in the work here. It seems like some demonic ritual was triggered at the moment of SK's death, because we see the abyss lurking in the backdrop and the outline of a closed fist with 5 silhouettes on top of it, and we're pretty sure it's not an eclipse or an incarnation ceremony. Doesn't matter though, because this is where the biggest confirmation that it was indeed the moment of the collapse of Gaiseric's empire shows up in the form of Void, who is flanked by 4 other demonic-looking creatures, bringing the grand total of astral beings present to, you guessed it, the magic number 5. When Guts sees this from SK's POV, he lashes out in real time, but is held back by Hanar's chains and the next vision, which shows us Skull Knight holding a woman that looks a lot like the Flower Storm Monarch in his arms. She has the brand of sacrifice on her left shoulder, and it looks like she's mortally wounded because just as she passes out, a massive brand of sacrifice appears on the ground, and then Sheercase snaps Guts out of the vision. He immediately questions whether what he just saw was an eclipse, and Skull Knight answers him by saying what he just saw was the end of a foolish king and the beginning of a wraith wandering through the endless night. Miura wasn't done there with his now overt messaging about the Skull Knight's identity, because in the very next chapter, he shows SK visiting a mausoleum dedicated to that woman from the vision, who is known as the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms. As he's doing so, Danon shows up, and she's the spitting image of the Lady Priestess. She asks him if he was there to pay his respect to the lady, and Skull Knight cryptically states that all he lives for now is vengeance. But the way Miura draws it, you'd think these two are old lovers meeting each other after they both suffered a severe bout of amnesia. These things at the very least solidify SK as Gaiseric post-death, and there are other hints as well. The Wicker Man that attacked Guts & Co. upon their arrival to Elfhelm was said to be made out of the souls of some human invaders who had come to the island centuries ago. The same was true for the Viking golems that Danon had Casca practicing with, because those armor sets most likely belonged to those sacrificed Vikings. Gedfring's father's name was Vid, according to Skull Knight himself, and Vid is a decidedly Nordic name, and all of this is to say that the Viking unit that invaded Skellig Island most likely belonged to Gaiseric in his human days. This is important to note because it tells us a lot about how Gaiseric's conquest might have gone back in the day, and also answers many questions regarding the fairy tale of the Skull King, starting with its name. It's possible that once Gaiseric took over Skellig Island, he acquired the Berserker armor and earned his reputation as a demon king because of his usage of said armor. The reason why no one knows of him before he emerged as the Berserker is because he was likely one of many tribe chieftains at a time that was tumultuous to say the least. We think that Gaiseric's contingent arrived on Skellig Island, he managed to befriend its inhabitants, fell in love with the Lady Priestess, and then took the Berserker armor to basically unite the continent of man. Once that had happened, Gaiseric had no reason to fight anymore, so he focused on building, and built the greatest, most advanced city in the entire world. When Rickard arrives in Falconia, he notes that the city itself is older than the Falcon's castle, and that the city has some insanely advanced infrastructure like running drains and fire extinguishers and more. This hints at the possibility that the rumors about Gaiseric's capital of debauchery were not entirely true, because technological marvels like these were being innovated 1,000 years before the current timeline, which still doesn't have them. But it must have been true to a certain extent, because it appears as though Gaiseric did end up letting go of himself and torturing the sage that used to be Void for the simple act of speaking out against his sins. It's possible that prolonged usage of the Berserker armor amplified all of Gaiseric's baser instincts and desires, and he just ended up spiraling out of control, letting the power of magic and rage addle his brain, until one day, Void managed to do the unthinkable. See, during the lead up to the incarnation ceremony, Skull Knight kept saying that all moves as if parallel to that time. Knowing what we know now, we can only imagine he was talking about the demonic ritual he himself witnessed, because, curiously enough, the downfall of Gaiseric's empire lines up with not one, but two demonic rituals. It roughly lines up with the timeline for the first eclipse in the current cycle of 5, and it also lines up with the timeline for the first incarnation ceremony, which is said to take place once in 1,000 years. So here's what we think happened. At some point after establishing a continental empire, Gaiseric and Void got into a public conflict, and he used his authority as king to imprison and torture Void. Void then got the Crimson Behelit and used his pain and suffering and deep desire to change the world, and he did, by transforming into the first God Hand and using the citizens of Gaiseric's capital as his sacrifices. This explains the brand of sacrifice on the foreheads of the corpses at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth, as it makes sense that Void would sacrifice the people he thought sinful, aka Gaiseric and the citizens he thought were his people. This leads to the birth of the first God Hand member, or the fifth in the old cycle, depending on whom you believe. Check out our video on the old God Hand for more information on that, but after this reincarnation, Void basically uses his spatial powers to tank Gaiseric's capital into the earth, and vanishes into the astral world, where he patiently gets to work on manipulating the events that led to the current storyline alongside the idea of evil. This explains why the first thing that Skull Knight did upon entering Griffith's eclipse was to go for Void, and why Void is the only one he addresses by name. His grudge as the Wandering Wraith might be with all inhumans in general, but his grudge as the lingering soul of King Gaiseric is with Void, the sage that took away everything, including the woman he loved. Many people believe this is why Skull Knight saved both Guts and Casca, because he didn't want the same thing to happen again, and we believe that that might just be true. The reason why Skull Knight says the Chapter 362 flashback was the end of a foolish king is because after 1,000 years of contemplation as a wandering wraith, he has come to realize just how fruitless his former glory was in the grand scheme of things. In a way, he knows that he created the monster he's hunting down today, and this is why we think Kentaro Miura said that Berserk is a 1,000-year tale. Currently, Griffith is doing everything Gaiseric did, but from a reverse perspective, given that he is a God Hand member, and the struggler in all of this is a guy born from the corpse of his mother. The only thing that makes Skull Knight and Guts similar is their usage of the Berserker armor and their shared struggles against the God Hand. But their reasons are different, despite seeming similar on the surface. Guts is all about pure vengeance, whereas the Skull Knight's revenge has a more Crusade-esque tone to it now. 1,000 years of fighting against causality has made him infinitely wiser, to the point that he recognizes his own flaws as a human, and if that isn't peak character progression, then we don't know what is. Marvelous verdict. But sadly, this is where we have to end the video, because that's all we have for you on this topic. The mystery of the downfall of King Gaiseric's empire is one of the most intriguing aspects of Berserk's story, because it not only tells us what happened in the past, it hints at what could happen in the future. We just called Griffith Reverse Gaiseric, and the sweet irony of that is, Griffith might be king of mankind in practice right now, but he hasn't been officially crowned. He might be sleeping with Princess Charlotte, but they aren't officially married. Both of these events seem to have been intentionally delayed for what we're guessing will be the demonic ritual to end all demonic rituals, because as we know, Griffith isn't really human anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. The final arc of Berserk will see Guts trying to avoid a ceremony quite like the one that led to the downfall of Gaiseric's empire in our opinion. And if it does, we called it, and it would be absolute poetry to say the least. But that's our thoughts on all of this stuff. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments section down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.